My name is Maureen Randall, and I've been a docent at the museum for 4 years. Actors talk about Broadway. Each performance is different because of the audience brings itself to it, and doing a tour is the same way. I did a tour with the high school. I could tell that they had never seen anything like it, and it kind of made me see you don't give credit to young people sometimes, that they can appreciate this kind of art. And the one piece that they were drawn to was the David with Goliath's head. They thought the red hat was fantastic. They talked about him holding Goliath's head. They said, like, what do you think is happening there? And somebody said, what am I going to do with this head? To me, art is almost like anthropology because it lets me see what was important in that time period. When people say like, oh, I don't like Baroque, or I don't like this kind of like late Renaissance or this kind of stuff, I tell them, this means nothing to you. But if you had been living, 800 years ago, you would understand that this means this and this means that. Now they're seeing that other meaning. And that's where I think the docents really come through for the public, because we're there to tell them these stories.
You're listening to Binder. I'm Ray McManus. I am here with Anna House. Anna, tell us who you are and what you do.
So I am an associate professor of Italian Renaissance art history in the School of Visual Art and Design at the University of South Carolina.
How long have you been at the university?
Since 2014.
Okay.
Yes. And it's been a great time. I have to say, I love Columbia and I love the CMA.
Yeah. I think, honestly, for me, it's like inseparable, right? I can't think of Columbia without thinking of the CMA. And of course, deep affinity for USC. I went to school there, never left, actually, and then ended up going to the branch campus. But you have, I think, a rather fascinating sort of job there. I mean,
well, thank you. Yeah, I think so too. So I really love teaching the survey course, the 100 level course that's sometimes called Caves to Cathedrals. It's from Paleolithic art through about 1400 in Europe. And so that brings in students from all over. It's one of these core curriculum courses. And then I teach upper level courses, including the master's students, on things that are within my training in Italian Renaissance and Baroque art.
So
Yes.
What is it about those two things? What does that mean to you as a scholar and as an educator?
I have to go way back to start to answer this question, which and say that I grew up near Washington, D.C. And spent a lot of time at the National Gallery of Art in D.C., which has a huge Kress collection. But famously, when I was very young, I was so drawn in by a Baroque painting that I just touched the surface of it at the National Gallery, which set off silent alarms, and I had armed security. In my mind, they're armed. I don't remember. I don't know if they're actually armed, but they all came in and were like, little girl, what are you doing? But I was just, so enthralled by this beautiful textured oil surface of a painting. And upon reflection, I thought, at that moment, two paths opened up for me. It was either art historian or life of crime. And I decided to go the art history route. And I had a very linear kind of path. A lot of people have a lot of jobs before they end up on what they really like to do. But I had an excellent AP art history teacher in high school, and then a wonderful mentor and professor who was a specialist in the Italian Renaissance in college. I decided to study abroad in Florence. And so I interned. I was an intern at the Uffizi Gallery. I took a seminar on Botticelli, and I was able to kind of live among Botticelli's works at the Uffizi. I took a seminar on Medici patronage. And I lived on the same street as the Palazzo Medici, the Medici Palace, and their churches like San Lorenzo and San Marco. And it just really became very alive for me. But I think that I was also interested in things outside of the traditional narratives. Once I had learned about, Renaissance Florence and Rome and those kinds of things, I became interested in women artists. My mentor worked on maiolica and other kinds of objects that were related to birth and to kind of women's lives, domestic interiors. I don't know. It was partially a great interest of mine, and then partially this lucky thing of having people who kind of nudged me in that direction. And I went straight from college into graduate school, worked with my wonderful professor, Patricia Fortini Brown at Princeton, who's one of the world specialists on Venetian art. And so I've been in school since I was 4. It's a very comfortable place for me.
Yeah. In a very weird kind of way, you were called to it. I mean, that painting was calling you and called you into everything that you're doing now. Watching you talk about it, and of course, listeners can't see this, but I mean, you're
I'm so glad listeners can't see me in my yoga clothes right now.
but you light up. I mean, when you're talking about it, I mean, like you're genuinely excited about it. And like, you can tell that this is what you're supposed to be doing.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, the community of scholars and also of students and, my colleagues really help with that.
Sure. Yeah.
They make it, something that's continually lively for me.
Well, thank goodness. Because, I mean, it would really be a bad end of the story. Like, I've lived this wonderful life of doing everything I want to do, but the place I work sucks, and everybody hates me. But he couldn't say that about USC. I mean, but, I know that is a period where most people would recognize certain pieces. But is it been your experience, especially when you're teaching and that sort of thing, do you find students have sort of similar reactions or even recognize it?
Right. I think that they're always really glad because they do recognize, Michelangelo's David, Leonardo's Mona Lisa, Raphael's frescoes from the Vatican stanza with Plato and Aristotle. But they are so famous just as images, and they're things that, you can see the Mona Lisa wearing a pirate hat or, or in advertisements. And so they have not been thinking about those works in their original contexts in which they were made.
Demons, omens, codes, monks, Da Vinci.
I say, if you see, a film, like, we talk about the Da Vinci Code, that there's nothing art historical about the Da Vinci Code and the claims that it makes. But it's interesting as a moment of popular culture. And we want to think about, why these things have exerted such influence, why they continue to fascinate us today. So even those kinds of, seemingly novel pop cultural things can generate discussion. Renaissance originally referred to the rebirth of classical antiquity. So people in Europe thinking about art from the classical period, like the 1st century CE under the Roman Empire, or 5th century BCE, classical Greece. And so we see that in Italy, sort of in the early 14th century, kind of the beginning of the Renaissance, through about the beginning of the 17th century. And Baroque art, we associate a lot with the Counter-Reformation. So when the Protestant Reformation came around, Martin Luther nails his theses to the door of Wittenberg Cathedral. There were a lot of changes in art of the time. So the decadence of the Catholic Church, as the Protestants would have it, was really reflected in its art. Protestant art wanted to be a lot more didactic, a lot more straightforward, to avoid any kind of superstition, anything like that. But really, Catholics kind of doubled down and just made the most kind of beautiful and extravagant art possible, which we see in the Baroque period in the 17th century.
Let's talk a little bit about the European Splendors exhibit. Put you on the spot here, but what do you think are some must-see pieces in that space?
Well, if I can say first that I'm just so glad that these works are back. And I don't know if everyone in Colombia knows about the Kress collection, the fact that we had a Kress department store. And so when Samuel Kress, he died and created the Kress Foundation, a lot of his work went to the National Gallery in DC, but then there was this amazing distribution of works to 95 regional and university museums throughout the country. So it's just a lucky thing that we have a Kress collection. It's been on loan for a little while, so I'm very, very happy that it's back. So yeah, there's a great variety of things in European Splendors, from kind of religious, Christian devotional paintings to portraiture to landscape to big historical kind of narrative paintings. I love a great deal of them. So we were just talking about Leonardo and the Mona Lisa. So there's this female portrait, lady with a scorpion chain, which was done by a follower of Leonardo, Giovanni Boltraffio. And it's this great kind of spooky, smoky portrait of a woman not identified. None of the portraits in the show are identified. We don't know who any of them is. But there's a possibility now that Leonardo may have done some of the underdrawing of this work. So not the painting, but the underlayer of this painting. And so it's a great one to see and to relate to Leonardo's paintings like the Mona Lisa or the Ginevra di Benci, which is in the National Gallery. There's been a lot of intrigue lately about paintings by Leonardo and his followers, like the Salvator Mundi.
And the piece is sold.
Couple of years ago that was auctioned off. So that's a very cool one to see. There's a great still life painting by Peter Klaas. And, with still life, I'm just teaching a Baroque class right now. We think about still life really being painting as painting, really meant as something that you put on your wall among other paintings to be admired in a kind of gallery-like setting, which is not the same thing as the earlier paintings in the show that are maybe either portraits that are meant to remind you of the individual appearance of someone, or a religious painting that's meant to aid in devotion. This really is kind of painting as painting. So I like that one a lot too.
One of the things that, I think most people are going to see in a lot of the images and a lot of the paintings, Madonna and Child, and then, later, Jesus and
the resurrected Christ.
The resurrected
this beautiful
Christ.
Sebastiano Ricci painting. The risen Christ. Yeah.
This question's not loaded, because, because you did write an article a while back that, I enjoyed it. I think others enjoyed it. Maybe, others enjoyed might be the right word. I don't know, but you cannot help. I mean, once you read that article, once you see that this depiction of Christ really sort of, at least today, the people who still believe that that's how he looked like, you can totally see how that the art has informed for centuries how people have seen him.
Yeah.
Even though historically and geographically, these two things just do not align. I mean, So I would love to talk about this.
Yeah. The title is The Long History of How Jesus Came to Resemble a White European. I was asked to write it by The Conversation a couple of years ago. The George Floyd protests were going on. It was really the depths of COVID. I was being very careful and staying home a lot of the time and watching the news. It felt like something that I could do to give some context to certain areas of white supremacy, I guess I would say.
Absolutely.
So you do see in European Splendors, you will see Christ depicted as a white European made by white European artists. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, right? So, something that I show in the article is that naturally people tend to make Christ in their own image. And so you'll see worldwide, you'll see Ethiopian Christ or Indian or Korean, Christ, Latin American, et cetera, et cetera. And it's people grappling with a lot of things, So in early Christianity, there really was no visual tradition. They were coming up with it themselves, borrowing from pagan predecessors, borrowing from images of Apollo, for example, the sun god, the good shepherd, Christ as the good shepherd, these kind of syncretic images. There was tradition that believed that Christ had left his own image, had been a kind of self-portraitist, the Vera icon, the true image of Christ. But really, they're all grappling with this idea of a God made human. And so if we believe that we are made in God's image, then Christ is the human form of God on earth, then of course you're going to see some resemblance between yourself and the human form of your God. But, it really became problematic during European colonization when those images were brought along with colonizers, and then they became these kind of authoritative images of Christ. It's still, it's incredibly relevant. There was a study out of Stanford in 2020 by a psychologist that showed that how people imagine God correlates exactly to how they imagine the ideal leader. So if you think, if you think of a white Jesus, or if you think of God as being a white man, assigning a race and gender to God, you are more likely to want to have a white boss or a white president. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important to kind of problematize, or to at least understand the history of these kind of images that people are consuming.
Sure. What sort of, I guess, was intriguing to me was that, because growing up, that was, in every Sunday school classroom I went to, it was the same picture: brown hair, blue eyes, looking up, beard, or, as the shepherd with the sheep and the children. And then at some point in the 2000s, you began to see a lot of artist depiction of Jesus with an AR, and Jesus, getting a tattoo, or, this.
Okay. You need to send me some of these images.
Well, I can, because that's a lot of that was what was feeding into Red Dirt Jesus.
Your book.
But the idea that, just as you said, culturally, we want to see our own sort of image in this. And so I always felt like I was interested in sort of the common man iconography, of Jesus as a truck driver, or, Jesus as the outlaw Josie Wales, or, or just Clint Eastwood in general, or zombie Jesus, and things like that, which I got in some trouble for. But
well, I got in some trouble for this article as well. I guess, if you put white and Jesus together on the internet, there's going to be some controversy. And I got a lot of emails, a lot of interesting tweets. There were emails sent to my entire department, my whole faculty. There was a real variety of responses to it, but, mostly very good and in the spirit in which it was written. But I wanted to say something earlier, because you were talking about the kind of standard image of Jesus that you see in a lot of American churches. And one thing that I learned writing this essay was about this Warner Sallman Head of Christ from 1940, which really became such a standard. It really set a standard in the U.S. And one of his successes, one of the reasons that it became so widely distributed, was that he worked with both a Protestant and a Catholic publishing company. And they put that image everywhere. So it was on hymnals and prayer books and prayer cards, stained glass. Mm-hmm. There were reproduction oil paintings that you could take home, and calendars. And so it just became this ubiquitous image of Jesus. But if you look at it, it's so much of its time. It's from 1940. And it looks very much like a studio portrait of a Hollywood star, right? So he's looking off screen, out of frame. He's kind of beautifully lit from the side and looking slightly up, but you can really appreciate his beautiful profile. So it's so much about a very particular ideal of beauty that was of a certain time, the very opposite of the idea that it's this universal thing of God becoming man, when it looks very much like a very, very particular slice of the population.
Right, exactly. You cannot help but plot certain points throughout history where we have made a mistake. I mean, and then after a while, like, okay, a lot of mistakes were made.
Yeah.
And for me, there's something exciting about truth and finding truth. And when you think about what's the one thing that has plagued, most humans when it comes to religion, is that really there's only one way to kind of find that truth, and nobody's really wanting to go there because you don't get to come back and tell people what the truth was. So
when it becomes kind of dogmatic.
I mean, so at least this is something we can, look at as, like, look, there is historical artifact to back this up, I mean, one could tote that they have a shroud, or one can say that they see an image in toast, but this is survivable artwork that has been preserved and is on view here. That you can see, that you can literally plot back and chart how these depictions have been created and have carried forward.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And of course, Samuel Kress wasn't collecting these works, and the Columbia Museum of Art is not collecting these works because of any kind of religious resonance. They are artifacts of the Italian Renaissance, of this important core of history and Western civilization, another problematic term. There's so much more that you can take from them. If I were looking at, say, Deodato Orlandi's painting of the Virgin and Child with my Italian Renaissance class, we would be thinking about how it derives from kind of Byzantine icons. We would be looking at the materials and the way in which it was made. We would be thinking about a whole workshop. So the distribution of labor, how the named artist himself would probably not be doing a lot of the tasks involved in making a wooden oil and tempera and gold leaf on panel work like that. It holds a lot of historical interest outside of any kind of devotional, devotional resonance. I think it's really cool that European Splendors is up right now with this show of works by Elizabeth Catlett, who's a Mexican African-American artist. And so you really have, right in confrontation, these works that were so vaunted by these white European kind of old masters, with someone who is, a person who is kind of historically marginalized. And I hope that they activate each other, right? So you think about who gets to have their portrait made via Elizabeth Catlett, or, in the 14th or 15th century. And it's part of a larger trend of museums placing, not just thinking in terms of a chronological display of work, but larger kind of thematic treatments, or even contrasting treatments. And I can only recommend seeing works of art in person. There's only so much you can do on a screen. I can make things as large or as small as I want them to be. You have no sense of scale. You can't see the materials. So it's so rewarding to see things in person. And I think European Splendors really will reward your efforts to come see it.
Anna House teaches art history at the University of South Carolina School of Visual Art and Design. Her research focuses on intersections between Renaissance art and artists north and south of the Alps, artist biographies, and the reception of art. We'll have a link to her article we discussed on today's program in the show notes. Coming up.
When I'm up here writing, I don't want to be bothered. Maybe an athlete might call it the zone. I want to sense that being into that poem because it's a presence. It's something spiritual.
Libby Bernadine, after the break.
Hey y'all, producer Drew here. Look, it's that time of year again, and my bet is you're probably out there trying to find the perfect gift right now. You might be listening to this shopping on your phone or a computer, or maybe even driving to an actual store. Yikes. Here, let me make it easy for you. How about giving the gift of the CMA? Whether it's membership, an art class, concert tickets, admission to luxurious parties, or just general admission, when you give the CMA, you share a world of new, creative experiences. So this year, make it easy for yourself and visit our website, www.columbiamuseum.org. It's a one-stop shop for the gift of inspiration. I mean, why give a gift that can fit in a box? And now, back to the show.
This is from House in Need of Mooring. You, poetry, what have you done with leaves green tremble? The humid air that takes my breath away. The moon's path cut deep from sea to shore. Your images of cotton fields caked with blood. Who cares about indigo? It's been on sale forever. Detroit riots in the 60s. James Baldwin's TV comment, "The South is the soul of the nation." Now things are suspect in Minneapolis, Chicago, New York. Am I to speak of the clan of racism etched in hearts like brand on cattle? Of violence, of guns drawn from hips, of the howl of angry voices, of disease, how it ravages, robs the last years. You have left me, poetry, with no laurels for victors. I beg for a dust-up, a distant flash of heat. Strike me like fierce lightning, my language ripped, my landscape scarred, burning. I am Libby Bernadine, and I am a member of the Kick-Ass Women's Club at press53.com.
Nice. How long have you been writing poetry?
Well, periodically, I wrote all my life. I wrote poems when I was young, real young, like teen years, and short stories, with no idea about being interested in publishing them. I wrote them for particular reasons or for somebody. But anyway, I didn't really gear up better and begin to look at the craft of poetry until I was in my late 40s. And even then, it was a struggle. I was teaching at the university at the time, and it seemed like I was always just one step ahead of students. So I spent a lot of time preparing for my classes, and that took a lot of energy. So I was on and off writing there, and I got a few things published, and I wasn't smart about that. I wrote to the Georgia Review, for example. When I got the poems back, it was something like, "This is everything we don't like in poetry." So I thought, oh gosh, let's quit. So, but at that point, I began to study, to read more widely than I have. I've always read poems, but I began to focus more and concentrate. And so, yeah, I was late coming to thinking of myself as a poet and writing consistently and studying the elements of poetry.
There's a big part of me that would say that if the poetry editor of Georgia Review said that that work was absolutely the opposite of what they thought poetry is, I would have taken that as a compliment. But no, they think it's always wild. I love to ask that question because I think that sometimes people think that we, are just born poets, or that it's somehow part of our genetics. And we come to it with all kinds of interesting sort of ways. Truly, you have to live and have experiences and observe a world around you, I think, before you can really dive in. And you said the key, which is to read, right? Read other poetry. I mean, it would be like a musician trying to learn how to play an instrument, but not listening to music. I mean, like, how's it possible, right? But who are folks that you can come back to and enjoy reading and it just does something to you? Right.
Well, more recent poet that I've gotten very engaged with, and I'm learning more about him and his work, is James Loganbach. Long-term people I've been interested in, Mary Oliver, Joy Harjo. I had the pleasure of studying with Joy. She has written this poem. It's about fear, and it's about how she, as a Native American, gave up letting fear control her. And at one point in the poem, she reads, "My heart, my heart, my heart, my heart." And it just sent chills through me. And I said, I've got to meet her. So people like that I just get real attached to. And there are others right now. They may occur to me shortly.
That's all right.
And they come back.
No, well, they always do. I mean, one way or another, they always come back. I've one of the things that I like about what you do, and I think, and you do it very well in a very understated way, and I've told you this before, that if I could coin a phrase of the elegant badass, your picture would be right beside it, because there is an elegance to it. There's a polish on it, but you don't hold back. I mean, you dive into areas and subjects that, if you feel it is unjust and wrong, and I think most people who would read it would agree that was unjust or that was wrong, or, whether it's looking at what we're doing to our landscape or what humans are doing to one another, it's honest. I mean, I hear poets want to slip into personas, and go off into different directions, but yours is very much your voice and has such a command to it. And so I would love for you to talk a little bit about what you're trying to do when you are sitting down to write poems.
I'm thinking somehow I had a book, Brooks and Warren, and that old anthology. And in that anthology, it states the role of the poet is to chronicle the tragedies of the world. Mm. And in a way, it sort of took me back, because I kept thinking, well, I don't write poetry that can change the world or change an individual. And so it took me a while to come to see the richness of that. And I had this wonderful student she's a very good student, but we were doing, I think it was a Sylvia Plath poem, and she just lamented. She said, "Oh, why is poetry always about death or war or something miserable that has happened to somebody?" Well, of course, you and I know, when you're widely read, that it's not all that, but it's a lot that. Mm-hmm. And I felt like I didn't give a good answer, but I picked up on that. That phrase just came back to me. Young brain then. And I recited that, and we talked a little bit about the notion that poems are not to only be beautiful. They are to be that, but they're not only to be beautiful. And then more recently, I've come across this quote by Ellen Bass. One of the things that poetry does is to bear witness to the world as it is. And those last three words, "as it is," just struck me. And I thought, well, you've got to keep at, what do you see? I haven't dealt with racism, but I can bear witness to it. Mm-hmm. I can't write that it has affected me in a bad way, except to say, here's what I have witnessed, and here's this unjust thing that has happened. And so I've tried to step deeper into that. And I think House in Need of Mooring demonstrates that a little bit more. So I don't know if that answers what you were asking, but I just feel like if I can feel something, then I can write about it and express as a witness, this has happened. And I don't like that it's happened.
I know. I like that answer. I mean, I think people forget that, all pain wears the same, right? There are parts to our experience, our own personal experience, we can relate to a certain degree. But I love the fact that you understand the boundaries, right? Like you and I have not experienced racism, but we certainly have witnessed it and can call it out. And I love those two quotes because they really sort of balance out the project, I think, for poets, that, you know, part of us is that we are cataloging the tragedies of this world, and the other is that we are witnessing, say those three words again.
The world as it is.
As it is, right. That's the honesty. But I think too, there's a certain spiritualism that comes from, you know, for at least for me, right? When, you know, writing poetry is in a lot of ways church for me. Do you get a feeling like that sometimes?
Oh, I do. So I have a quote. I can't recall the complete quote by May Sarton. And she says that she cannot use language in a poem that she couldn't speak before God, and that she feels like writing poetry is a very spiritual act. And I feel that same way.
Yeah, I mean, and you feel like you are a part of something so much bigger than us, right? I mean, we are small compared to what we create. But we weren't just given that and just said, here, take this gift or take this opportunity and just play around with it. We're compelled at this point to like give everything we've got into it. I want to shift gears yet one more time to talk about your relationship with art and how that informs your poetry, or if it informs your poetry.
Well, it's very powerful, a strong influence, though I may never write anything connected to the art, say a particular piece of art, or I might start out and then the poem goes off somewhere else. Mm-hmm. But I think there's a strong connection between poetry and art in that we do have to write about things and paint things that I don't know what the word is. They're not always understandable, but we stand in awe before them. Like the first time I ever saw the Kress collection, I was probably in my early 30s, and it was over on Senate Street.
Right.
In the old Taylor building. And I just was awed in amazement that I was seeing something that was painted centuries ago. Yeah. And I think I felt a great inspiration toward some sensibility that I didn't know I had. That for me comes out in poetry. But I've written several poems that are poems about art or come directly from art. This poem is one that it will demonstrate what I was just talking about. And some years ago, when I was in the museum in Washington, I turned a corner, and when I turned the corner in a room, there in front of me was The Last Supper by Dolly. It just struck me. I mean, I thought, oh my God, amazing. Who could ever have done this? So I didn't have the painting in front of me, but I had a good sized picture of it, and I looked it up online. And this poem was like that. I was so struck by the painting. And the title is the longest title I've ever written, Ray. And it has words in it I sometimes stumble over, but here goes. How the painter Giovanni Signorini renders celebration as the people gather on the Ponte alla Carraria in Florence. On the feast day of John the Baptist, fireworks blister the night. The Baptist, who roamed the rugged hills of some Judean place, his celebration, the fire of repentance, harbinger of the Spirit, in his rough cloth, maybe a camel's pelt belted to hold his beastly strength, his itinerant ways. Embers is what Signorini has given, driving away the ennui of the people. He gathers them from around the fires to watch the gilded colors glow. See how the light reflects on their upturned faces, on the water, under the 19th century fishing boats, on the Italian facades lining the River Arno. Sparks of white light in the night reach for the quarter moon, and the people, breath held, know what has touched them. They know it is deep and true. These flames, this spirit, this fire inside.
Libby Bernadine is a poet based in Georgetown. She's released 2 collections of her poetry, Stones Ripe for Sowing in 2018 and House in Need of Mooring, which came out this past October, both published by Press 53. You can order her books from press53.com. I think when you think about art and spirituality and the way in which religion is represented in art and the way in which we take certain aspects of our own religious rituals, beliefs, and things to our art as artists, it's kind of hard to separate the two. I was never really, and I'm certainly not today, a churchy kind of guy. I've always been in awe of things that you cannot just put your finger on to explain. And art, I think, operates that way. Nature operates that way. And certainly, for me, poetry operates that way. There are times when I cannot explain why I do the things I do. I might make a joke and say that it's compulsion. I might make a joke and say I made a mistake and it turned out to be brilliant. But the truth is that I think there are certain aspects to what we do that we are gifted, and I don't mean gifted in the sense that we are special gifted people. We're given a gift to be able to do this, whatever this is. And I think there are times when it makes perfect sense for us to pay homage to that. But, we need to be reminded sometimes that, an artist is simply depicting what he or she feels and what he or she believes. And we can appreciate that, but we should be careful as to whether or not we want to automatically believe it too. Art and poetry is always diving at a truth. And sometimes that truth isn't what we wanted to hear. And sometimes it's not what we want to see, but we're given these tools. We're given these brains. We're given these opportunities. And I don't think we should take that lightly. You've been listening to Binder, a production of the Columbia Museum of Art. Today's episode was hosted by me, Ray McManus, produced and edited by Drew Barron, with special assistance from Joel Ryan Cook. For more information about CMA exhibitions and programs, visit our website at www.columbiamuseum.org.
Cool. And then can you just give me like a coming up and then like a Libby Bernadine after the break or something to that effect?
Coming up.